Roy Godfrey just retired.
Mm-hmm. He would have come
John
with
Plummer.
John Plummer. I knew well, and John Plummer, Roy, Paul Elledge was a good friend.
And he retired a number of years ago. I
He
took
was,
a class
yeah.
with him.
Did you? Yeah.
I think he might have been chair of the department when I started.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're ready.
We're ready? Okay. Well, hello. Can you tell me your name?
So my name is Elizabeth Langland.
And just a few questions about your childhood, where you grew up, and when you came to Vanderbilt and what you taught at Vanderbilt.
Well, I grew up in two very different places. I was raised for the first 11 years of my life in Laramie, Wyoming, where my father was on the faculty of the University of Wyoming. And then he took a job at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and we moved to Amherst, Massachusetts when I was 11, and that's where I did junior high and high school. I came to Vanderbilt in 1975, my first job after completing my dissertation at the University of Chicago.
Okay.
And I was here till 1982.
Okay, thanks. And I guess I want to ask you a little bit about your own college experiences, and could you talk a little bit about how the environment or the climate for students on campus at Vanderbilt compared to the environment of your undergraduate institution?
Yes, I can. I went to Barnard College, so I went to a women's college. And at Barnard at that time, there was a strong feeling that all women should make an important contribution, however one wanted to do that. Barnard was very proud of the fact that among the seven sisters, it at least bragged that it had the most who'd gone on to professional careers. And so I received a lot of support at Barnard. Even though I was married in my senior year, which was kind of nutty, at a coeducational institution, I would not have been supported. And in fact, at the time, what I was told in terms of going on to graduate school, first I was encouraged by Barnard. They said, definitely you must go on to graduate school. And at other certain institutions, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all were reputed not to accept women who were married as graduate students because obviously you were just going to drop out. That was the thinking at that time. So I was very glad I received a 4-year Ford Foundation Fellowship at the University of Chicago. And that's where I did my PhD work. But while I was in undergrad, I also, in my senior year, because I married someone who was at Princeton, I took a course at Princeton. And I also took some summer courses at UMass Amherst when we went back for the summer. It was a very different atmosphere from a women's college. I would speak because I had been at a women's college. I would speak in class, and the young men would say, "Do you always talk this much?" So when I came to Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt was very much a coeducational institution, somewhat in that model of men speaking and women being largely silent. But there, I had a wonderful, wonderful experience of starting the Women's Studies program. And that was out of a hunger from the women's students. And so when I taught that first Women's Studies course, Images of Women in Literature, Religion, and Art, with Gay Welch and Christine McCorkle, we had a class full of women who were eager to talk. And so it was quite wonderful.
What year was that? Do you recall?
No. I'm trying to think, what year would it have been? Because I did not, feminist criticism was absolutely new at that time. I had the extreme good fortune of working at Barnard with two major feminists. Kate Millett, who had just written Sexual Politics, was my freshman English teacher. She was extraordinary. And I was seated by Susan Mailer, Norman Mailer's daughter. So, and what I love about Kate Millett, and I will remember to this day, and she's probably responsible for a lot of what happened to me in all kinds of wonderful ways, but we were discussing Tennyson's poem Ulysses in class, and I ventured a defense of Ulysses, and she just tore my argument to shreds. So I stopped. And she looked at me and she said, well, argue, why don't you?
Mm.
And she was saying, you need to speak. You need to respond. And that was a lesson I never forgot. So she was critical. So I had been taught at Barnard by feminist critics. I went to the University of Chicago, and I focused on theory of the novel. I studied with Wayne Booth and Sheldon Sachs. And so I hadn't absorbed as a methodology the kinds of things. And the other person with Kate Millett and Catherine Stimson, she was the other person at Barnard, were doing. But obviously, they had planted a seed, because when I came here, I became very interested almost immediately. And I'm not sure how it started, but I know the students wanted the course, and I thought, oh, that'll be fun to develop, and we got started.
So was it part of a program at that point, or was it just a standalone?
It was a standalone course.
Mm-hmm.
And then they wanted a women's studies program. And see, I wish I had some of these details. Gay might have some. Susan probably has some. And Nina Gove was the other person. But I am a new assistant professor. Right. So that would not be wise, probably, to start a new program in women's studies. So we agreed, since I was keenly interested, that we would have a troika, as we called it. The three of us would together work to develop women's studies. That was a kind of wonderful moment. Those were great times, I have to say. At the dawn of this new era with this exciting new perspective, and working with women and teaching students who were so excited. It was wonderful.
Yeah, they hadn't had that experience.
No, they had not.
So can you say anything more about typical students at Vanderbilt? If you encountered such a thing, both men and women? You said that the women students were more silent. I'm assuming they were more active, engaged in the women's studies classes. But any other sort of comments that you could make about sort of stereotypical Vanderbilt students at the time you were here?
You know, I thought about that question, and what I remember is that I had very smart students. They really were very good. And it's true the men did speak more in class, but then because I got into women's studies, I think the women felt more confident in speaking up, and maybe even having me as a teacher made it more possible for them, too, to speak. Because remember, when we're talking about typical classes, we're talking about male faculty. Mm-hmm. That makes a difference, too, in a dynamic, as we know.
Mm-hmm. So were there many other women faculty members at Vanderbilt?
No, there was a woman hired the year before I came, named Melissa Cannon. That was the first woman who had been hired on the tenure track, and I was the second.
Is this in the Department of English or in
Department of English?
Okay.
Yes. Yes, and I don't know if Susan talked about her experience, so I'm going to take a little bit of a byroad here. But when she came, when she and her family moved to Nashville, she taught at Fisk. Because everyone said, because she's a distinguished classicist, said, what a pity you can't teach at Vanderbilt, because Vanderbilt doesn't accept women. And so I don't know what year that was, but that can't have been much before I came. But suddenly Vanderbilt was hiring women, but it was not easy. I remember being stopped in the hall by a male graduate student when I got there, and he said, you know, the only reason you were hired is because you're a woman. I said, well, thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Welcome to Vanderbilt. and there was a little bit of that, well, a little bit, probably more than a little bit of that attitude. And I know Melissa Cannon really struggled. It was really hard for her, and she never found the kind of place that I did, because women's studies and that community became a kind of home for me.
Was she in another field? Like, what was her specialty?
Poetry, 20th century, if I recall. It's been a long, long time, and she kind of disappeared. I don't even know if she stayed in the profession.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she she didn't. I don't even think she stayed to go up for tenure.
Okay.
I don't remember what happened.
I feel like, did you know Ann Cook when you were there?
Yes, I did.
So did she get tenure, or was she hired on the tenure track, or do you know anything
Yes,
about
I
that
do know a
situation?
lot about her. She was a long time in a non-tenure track job when I came to Vanderbilt, and I didn't know her well, but she was apparently very happy in that position. When Vanderbilt turned me down for tenure, they suddenly put her on the tenure track and tenured her. And I think it looked to a lot of people like an effort to show, see, we can tenure women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Just back to a question about the students. Any tensions between male and female students that you saw?
The interesting thing is I don't remember any tensions between male and female students, and I had a lot of male students who supported me and were very interested actually in women's studies too.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't remember tensions. Right. Have others spoken of tension?
It depends on the discipline, is
Okay.
what I've heard.
Okay.
So that there were some tensions in maybe some more STEM fields.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I've interviewed people who were at Vanderbilt in the 60s
Of course.
and the 70s and early 80s. So
Mhm.
I think that there was probably more in the earlier period. And one of the interesting things that we've discovered in our research is there was a lot of hostility towards women students very early on.
Ah.
So from the 1870s through the 1950s, say,
Mm-hmm.
it was almost like, and there were quotas, you know.
I
And
didn't.
I think even while you were here,
There was a quota?
there were still quotas. Those didn't
Wow.
get lifted until the 70s. The actual date is escaping me now. All I know is that
Mm-hmm.
in 1981 was when we saw kind of half women, half men.
Okay.
But into the 70s,
Yeah.
it was like a quarter women were
Mhm.
allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there was, hostility because maybe women were perceived as taking places away from men.
Yes.
So that was something that we've seen in our research. So did you feel supported? I mean, what was the climate for women faculty? You said that there weren't very many of you.
No. We probably all knew each other. I did. There were some people who were not supportive, but there were so many who were supportive, not just women, but men in the department who became very good friends to whom I was very close, and men outside of the department too.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful people who really helped me along the way in so many different ways. And Paul Illich was one of those.
Mm-hmm. So did you feel that students were receptive since they didn't see very many women who were faculty members?
An interesting question. They were hungry, it was what I felt.
Mm-hmm.
They were hungry for a different experience, a different perspective, hungry for feminist theory and criticism, actually, for looking at women's writing. The canon at that time was almost exclusively male. And just to think of how it's broadened due to the research of largely, feminists, could be male or female, feminist critics and theorists is amazing. And now, of course, black critics and theorists, we've got a very different canon than we had in 1970 to 75 when I came.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you just needed that variety of perspectives. Those other, The canon is wonderful. The canon as it was then was wonderful. But you just felt a hunger to see your own experiences or something comparable to your experiences represented.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what literature does so brilliantly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, would you say that the campus the students were politically engaged? Because what I'm hearing in your
Yeah.
response is there was a hunger within the academic context,
Mm-hmm.
but I wondered, did it translate over into any kind of engagement with the women's movement that was happening in the 70s?
Well, I didn't see a lot of that. What they did become engaged with was WEAVE, which
Mhm.
Susan would have spoken of, Women's Equity at Vanderbilt, something right there affecting them,
Mm-hmm.
right where they live. And maybe that, I'd be interested to know for how many that might have led to wider engagement going on. But sometimes you need that immediate experience to really engage you in the larger issues so that they're not abstract and they come home to you in a very immediate way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. So one of the things that we have done is we've read the newsletters that were produced by the Women's Center.
Oh, great.
And so I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the Women's
Okay.
Center.
Yes,
Were you at all, so you were here
I was here.
when the Women's Center opened. Did you have any engagement with or connection with the Women's Center?
Well, yes. And I remember even giving a couple of talks at the Women's Center. I'm trying to think, it might have actually been on, which book was it? It was I'm trying to think, but one of the major books, it wasn't Simone de Beauvoir, but it was, maybe I'll think of which one it was, giving talks and talking about what the experiences that lay behind these kind of insights. So yes, I did. Who was the first director of
Nancy Ransom.
I was going to say I knew Nancy well because I thought, was it Nancy? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And she was great. And I don't know if this was a concern at the time or only in retrospect, because I've been thinking about that question, the relationship between the Women's Center and women's literature, feminist theory, feminist criticism. And I think one of the concerns that some of us may have had was just a fear that somehow that Vanderbilt might bracket women's experience into sort of needing their own special place instead of taking women seriously, a sort of coddling, oh, you need your own little place and that's where you can be, but the real world is out here.
Mm.
And so there was always at the beginning a little bit of that tension that rather than taking women seriously, you were just saying, okay, have your little space where you can talk.
So are you saying that there was some kind of questioning of the Women's Center itself as a project? Because it might be diminishing in some way, or?
That I think there was a concern that you establish a women's center and that's it, once and done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And not so much, not a diminishing so much as, that's all we need to do. And Susan and I were talking last night, and she mentioned, because we had a commission on the status of women.
Right.
Got the Women's Center. Now she says Vanderbilt has another commission on the status of women.
Well, they haven't created the commission
Okay.
yet, but the provost...
40 years later. Well, what's happening?
The provost announced that she is launching an initiative to examine the status of women at Vanderbilt.
Oh.
So I think that the way she explained it, we had a meeting about it this week, and the way she explained it was that she's hoping that it won't be this kind of one-year thing, that it will turn into kind of a standing committee with maybe subcommittees or task forces or
Oh,
something like
okay,
that.
good.
Which I think would make sense to have something ongoing. Because I think what we did have a few years ago was a committee on diversity, inclusion, and community, I think is what they called it.
Right.
And it met for a year and issued a report. And then there were some things that came of it.
Okay, good.
But it also sort of felt like, now they did that. That
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Um,
We've done that.
Mm-hmm. So I think that I'll be interested to see how this approach goes, because it could be more ongoing. And I think after the Women's Center started in 1978, from what I understand, there was the meeting of some kind of committee on diversity and inclusion or minority constituencies, but I don't know. I think it might have met through the 80s, but then it just stopped.
Oh, it did. Okay.
And I don't know why. So that was a conversation that we had this week with the provost. The sense that there was kind of, movement and interest, and then kind of, but I think it was also during the period of backlash, to the women's movement in the 80s.
Absolutely.
So it could have coincided with that. I don't know what the cause, so yeah. Were you at all, you said you spoke at the Women's Center on some books, or at least once. We, in our research looking at the newsletters, we definitely saw advertisements for women's studies classes, which was really interesting to see the way that the Women's Center and women's studies were trying to work together to kind of support each other. There was a program called Women's Week that we saw mentioned, but I haven't really been able to find out much about that. Do you know anything about Women's Week? Or is that just kind of a little drop in the pond?
I don't remember it right now, but if something ever comes to me, I'll let you know.
Okay. I wonder. It was student initiated.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I think that the women students were advised by Nancy at the Women's Center. But I just didn't know how involved faculty would have been in that kind of
Women's
programming.
Week, yeah.
So, can you talk a little bit about any gender discrimination that you faced when you were at Vanderbilt?
Yes. Yes. There are a couple of ways to think about it. One, and I suspect this has changed, but I'd be curious, was just because let me back up. I'm interested in things like maternity leave. And I had a 3.5-year-old and a 1-month-old when I arrived. And there was no compensation for childbearing. In fact, it really was supposed to be invisible. And in fact, to tell you the truth, I don't look large, but I have wide hips. And I was pregnant at the MLA, 5 months pregnant, when I interviewed on campus. And Vanderbilt didn't know. I wouldn't have said, because you wouldn't get hired if you were pregnant. Right. So the idea that you would want any special favors, and of course now institutions have maternity leave, paternity leave. I mean, where I am at Arizona State University, there are all kinds of stopping the tenure clock so that people can accommodate the life, having a family with having a career. None of that existed then for anyone. And so that was not, I would not say that was discriminatory. We were all treated the same, but it probably had more adverse impacts on women. But then, of course, when I came up for tenure, what I was told was that I hadn't published sufficiently in my field, which the dean defined as 18th century British literature. Well, I'd never specialized in 18th century British literature in my life. I guess if you define someone's field a certain way, they're not. Well, gee, she didn't publish anything in that field. And also, I had become keenly, as we've been talking about this, I've indicated, keenly interested in women's studies, feminist theory, and criticism, so I was writing in that area. I had done, ironically, I published one article that I just heard just literally this summer. It's been very interesting. Has been selected for the best, among the best articles in the 50 years of the journal. And it was my first feminist article on Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. So I thought, wow, if you live long enough. So, but I'd also done an absolutely extraordinary book as I think about it. I don't even, the lovely thing about being an assistant professor, you're apparently full of energy, because I decided that I should do this series of feminist perspective in the academy, the difference it makes.
Yes.
And I would invite these major scholars, as you know, how major were you? We were all junior faculty all over the United States. Maybe some of them were associate professors. So I invited all of these people, political science, anthropology, history, religion, all over, to come and speak at Vanderbilt. And then with Walter Gove, we did the book that was published by the University of Chicago Press. Well, those contributors, Nan Cohen was one. She became president of Wellesley and then of Duke. Judith Shapiro became president of Barnard. Pat Spax became president of the Modern Language Association, and she was at Yale. And she told me they used that book for over a decade at Yale. So it turned out to be, you know, they say never do an edited book before you get tenure.
Right.
But it turned out to be so impactful. But when I came up for tenure, none of that counted, because that was not in my field. So that would have been, if we want to talk about discrimination, you are discriminating among different kinds of things and saying this counts, this doesn't. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, can you talk a little bit about the experience of finding out about not getting tenure and your decision to respond in the way that you did?
Yes. Well, of course, as you may know, the dean waited until the campus was empty to deliver his decision. And I think after all that time, I wasn't exactly shocked. But then there was a question, do I just go? And then I thought, well, if I walk away and don't do anything, then when I had a son and a daughter, if they face the same thing, I won't have done anything. I won't have tried to change the way things are. So I felt not only that I'd have my own biological children, but I had all these metaphorical children as students. I felt, you know, all you can do is try. So make an effort, and maybe it contributes to change. And you can say, I tried. But if you walk away, then you haven't done that. And so that was it. And then I have to say, it was extraordinary, because I know so many women who faced analogous situations and had no support. I had extraordinary support. I mean, with Susan and Catherine Snow and Gay Welch and Nina Gove and we formed this Women's Equity at Vanderbilt, and we had, as you know, fundraisers and runs for Weave and all of these different things. It was really quite empowering. Yeah, that was it, empowering.
Yeah, to build that kind
It
of
was.
community.
You build that kind of community. I was never alone. It was extraordinary, really extraordinary. Yeah.
And so it sounds like you mentioned the Commission on the Status of Women. One of the sort of, commonalities that I noticed with Weave and the Commission's report, or the Commission itself, is that it was a collaborative effort of faculty and staff and students.
That's exactly right. Faculty, staff, and students. And some of the strongest supporters were men. Which is, amazing to think of when I look back. It's amazing. The students were ready for something new. It's interesting, a couple of things. When we started this, or we contemplated the lawsuit, I went to meet with the EEOC, the Equal Opportunity Commission. And the people said, well, your chances aren't very good of prevailing. Ronald Reagan has just appointed a new head of the EEOC. Who is? Clarence Thomas. Yes. So we knew the odds going in. But again, the point was not, well, it was indeed we would like to prevail, but the point was to make a commitment, make a stand, and try to make change. It's interesting because my son was 7 at a certain point during the lawsuit. And at one point he said to me, I hope you don't mind, Mom, but I'm glad I was born a boy. Isn't that extraordinary?
Wow.
Mm-hmm. I know.
So
he saw.
knew the significance of all of
Mm-hmm.
that. Wow.
He saw the privilege that he had for gender.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what was amazing? That it was when I was discriminated against that I thought, wow, I've been really lucky. And I realized that there were others who'd faced much more discrimination than I had. Black women, women of color. And I thought, what I came away from feeling is, wow, I've actually really been privileged.
But you mean because of the support that you received?
Well, because of being a white woman.
Yeah.
I have a wonderful colleague at ASU whose name is Neil Lester. He did his PhD at Vanderbilt. And he's a black man. And he does these workshops in which he asks people to think about having a backpack of privilege, of qualities, and what you put in it. Think about what you have. He says, I'm black. That's a negative. But I'm a male. That's positive. I'm educated. Positive. So you start thinking about your life in these complex ways, the ways in which everybody has certain privileges, maybe, and certain deficits and certain not. But if I may, just one anecdote from Neil. When he's at Vanderbilt as a PhD student, one faculty member asked him to sing Dixie in class. And he said, he said, well.
There was just actually on NPR yesterday afternoon.
Really?
A small segment on Dixie.
Really?
That's so funny that you say that.
Yeah.
And thinking about the different implications of Dixie and sort of,
Yes.
it ended with, I believe, a black woman singer who was performing it.
Yes.
And the response that she got.
How
But
interesting.
at any rate, what a horrible thing to be asked.
It was
in a
it
public
was
setting, in a
clearly
public setting.
horrible for him. Yeah. That was sad. So, but we're talking about privilege in these broad, and we all have certain privileges and certain ways we don't.
Mm-hmm. So did you feel, how did the experience, I know you talked about being supported by Weave. Was it awkward for you within the English department during the case? Or did you kind of connect more with the people that you had already been friends with?
That's a good point. Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. I connected with the people who had been good friends, and they remained good friends. It wasn't as if they sort of pulled away. I mean, Paul Elledge, people who are, of course, no longer there, but Don Alt, who left, actually, when I went to Florida, I hired him at Florida. He was a very strong supporter. And John Plummer was good. They were good friends with us. Scott Colley, who went on to become president of Berry College in Georgia. He was a good friend, too. So that I really felt supported. And maybe those who didn't support Weave and me just sort of kept a low profile, I think.
So when the way I understand the case was that there were two, was it that there were two trials? Because there was
We
an
had,
appeal?
we had, this is good. Testing my
Testing
memory
memory.
too. We certainly did have two court
Hearings. I
hearings.
guess that would be the better word.
Yes, and the first one was here in Nashville, if I remember. The judge was L. Claire Morton, and I don't know why we came back to Clarksville. This is very interesting. I'm not even. I at that point was already at Converse College
Okay.
for that second hearing,
Okay.
and maybe it was an appeal. Maybe that's what it was, but. L. Claire Morton, between the first and the second, had a stroke, as I understood it. I wasn't sure he actually completely remembered the first part of the trial and the second part, because there's certain things seem to drop out in his decision. But maybe he just saw it a different way. In any case, I probably should go back. Isn't it funny? Those things are they're so important at the time, and then, I should have this all clear in my mind, but I don't.
Well, but I guess it's, so would you say that would you say that you've spent a lot of time after, so what my question is really leading towards, have you spent a lot of time thinking about this? But I also wanted to kind of clarify the timeline, so that you left in 1982, right? So that
Yes.
after the decision, you stayed for a year.
Yes.
And I guess we formed that fall of 81.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
what were your feelings in leaving Vanderbilt? And then did you spend a lot of time thereafter thinking about it, or did you just become so busy that...
Well, there you go. I did. What happened was, once I didn't get tenure, I had to look for other jobs. So I did. And I interviewed for a job at Converse College, the women's college in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And it was for a beginning, it was either assistant or associate professor. I can't remember, but I thought, why not? And at Converse, which was it was an entirely women's college with an entirely male administration, and the president would interview all of the candidates for every position for half an hour. So he and I met, and half an hour turned into an hour, hour and a half, and we were talking about, he was very disappointed in the English department, so I was talking on and on about things they could do to increase majors, because they were losing majors. And he was also hiring a dean at that time, and he said to me, "I'm hiring a dean. Do you think I need to hire a woman?" And I said, obviously I didn't want the job. I wish, sometimes I think, boy, I was much braver. I said, no, you don't have to hire a woman, but you should hire a feminist. That's what I said. And then at the end he said, I like the way you think. I'm going to make you chair of the English department. So he did. They thought they were hiring an assistant professor, and he brought me in as chair of the English department over all these men.
Oh my gosh.
Who were shocked. and so I was very busy. I was very busy. Once I left, I was very busy. I was suddenly chair of the English department. And that was maybe my most successful. I've had a long administrative career, but we tripled majors in 3 years, and the men started writing and producing scholarship. And after 3 years, I wanted to be in a research university, so I applied, and I was offered jobs at Ohio State and University of Florida. And we went to the University of Florida. So I was busy. I didn't look back too much.
Yes. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have a favorite memory of your time at Vanderbilt?
Well, I think it has to be Weave.
Mm-hmm.
It was just so empowering to have that community. And then at the same time, I was working with 2 scholars in feminist criticism on another collection, Marianne Hirsch, who has subsequently become president of the Modern Language Association, and Elizabeth Abel. Marianne's at Columbia, Elizabeth is at Berkeley. And we were working on a collection about the female Bildungsroman. So those communities forming around this new way of thinking, it was extraordinary. It was a wonderful time.
Mm-hmm. Anything else that you would want to say about, the final question, there are two final questions that I have on my sheet. One is, what would have improved your experience at Vanderbilt, which you as you wish to answer. And then, how has your perspective on your Vanderbilt experience changed since leaving?
Well, I don't know. If suppose I'd gotten tenure and had not had some of those incredible bonding experiences, would that have improved my situation? It's really a hard question to answer, really hard. And then looking back, what I value, you see, is those extraordinary experiences of working with women and men to accomplish things. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.